Welcome to Parenting Teens with Dr. Cam, where we tackle the challenges of raising teenagers without the drama. I'm your host, Dr. Cam. Let's get on with the show. If you're like most parents, it can be a daily struggle trying to motivate your teen to do anything productive. But what if we could unlock the secret to turning their procrastination into action, their disinterest into engagement, and their resistance into enthusiasm? That's what we're going to talk about today. I'm thrilled to be joined by Dr. David Yeager, a professor of psychology at the University of Texas at Austin, who's renowned for his influential research alongside esteemed colleagues like Carol Dweck, Angela Duckworth, and Greg Walton. In his latest book, 10 to 25, The Science of Motivating Young People, can't wait to read that, Dr. Yeager dives deep into the science of adolescent motivation, and he's going to share some of his findings with us today. Dr. Yeager, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So let's start at the beginning. How did you get inspired to do this research?
Yeah, so I was a middle school teacher straight out of college, and I taught 6th through 8 English, and it was a low-income school, so I also taught K through 8 PE. So I taught 7, 8 preps a day, and I just struggled with all the challenges that you can imagine, everything from getting 3rd graders to line up for dodgeball or whatever sport to getting 7th graders to read The Once and Future King and The Outsiders and turn in essays on time. And I really just felt a little bit frustrated by the advice I had been given by the kind of scientific establishment in research. And that drove me to want to do better research. And so I've spent my life trying to do applied work that actually gives parents and teachers concrete suggestions about what to say and what not to say based on experiments that we've conducted in rigorous settings.
You have just piqued everyone's interest for sure. So I'm curious, first of all, what was the advice that you were given earlier that you were disappointed in and found did not work well?
Well, I think that, think back 20 years ago, what was the conversation about motivation for young people? And the two big ideas were, one, something about their traits. Like some kids just are motivated and other kids aren't. So some kids are helpless, some kids are extroverted, some kids are gregarious, other kids are reserved. And, it is the case that there are individual differences, but that's not particularly useful for me. I'm not going to give a personality test on the first day of class and be like, all right, well, you half of kids are just going to sit there like a lump on a log and I can't do anything for you.
Give up.
But the other line of research was promising, but wasn't based on experiments for what to do. And it was very abstract. It would say things like set a mastery goal, promote intrinsic motivation, not extrinsic motivation. And like the real world's a little more nuanced than that. I mean, like someone asked me recently, how do I motivate my 8-year-old? And I'm like, well, I use a lot of Pokemon cards and candy, for younger kids, because they kind of need a reason to get over the initial hump of something being super hard and not feeling good. Yeah. And then you build intrinsic motivation over time once they realize that it feels great to be successful at something. And then they do it because they want to press themselves, impress others. So I think the advice was either too simplistic or just not useful. And what I wanted was like, I walk in a room and if I say A, they're going to be more intrinsically motivated or more persistent than if I say B. And I want that clarity. And that's what we obsess over in our randomized experiments.
I love this and can't wait to hear more. So let's talk about really quickly, why does it feel so challenging to motivate our teenagers to begin with?
Yeah. So I think that the traditional narrative for why it's so hard to motivate our teenagers is that there's something wrong with this generation. Their brains have been kidnapped by their phones. The political unrest has caused them to be this or that. The companies are distracting them with A, B, or C. And look, there are a lot of things that are different than when we were growing up, for good and bad. I mean, we got to remember, for all the things that seem to be grabbing our attention now, think about how much more attention we can pay. Like you can get in a car right now and have no idea where you're going. And then Google Maps will just tell you. It's amazing. You used to spend so much time. Remember maps? Remember the physical map?
I remember getting lost a lot more.
Remember having to print out something on MapQuest and then you're like, my printer doesn't work or the internet's too slow. Like, everyone's complaining like we're too distracted, but like we wasted tons of time 15, 20, 30 years ago. So in my opinion, a lot of that stuff is kind of a net even. And really what's happening is older generations in general complain about younger generations. And that's happened back since Plato and Aristotle. I mean, you could read Aristotle's rhetoric, and you could read stuff that would sound like it would be in the Wall Street Journal tomorrow in the op-ed section. So what I want to do is say, like, all right, what are the timeless, unchanging aspects of the adolescent brain that are rooted in our hundreds of thousands of years of evolutionary history that aren't that different, but that instead just respond to differences in culture and technology at different eras?
Yeah.
And fundamentally what we think is that young people's brains from the kind of the onset of puberty start craving experiences of status and respect. That is, that the feeling of having earned a prestigious reputation in the eyes of someone whose opinions you care about has never felt so good as it did when your body was awash in testosterone and estradiol for both boys and girls. But also the humiliation or shame of being rejected, being unjustly accused by an adult, of failing publicly at something you really care about. That kind of never feels as worse as it does in that period. Yeah. And given that intensity of the emotions, the question is, all right, what are we going to do with that as parents? We can't tell kids to turn off their neurobiology and say, get over it, right? Instead, we have to be attuned to it and figure out how to harness it rather than being afraid of it.
Yeah, I love this because I think this is one of the things that we go back to where parents say, well, this is how I was raised and this worked for us. And I think you say, well, 20 years ago even, we didn't know nearly as much as we know now. We know so much more about the brain, about teen development that can help us curve back some of the trauma and some of the experience that we're still trying to recover from as adults. Let's be real. Like, we can prevent a lot of that from happening, which why wouldn't we if we could? So let's talk a little bit about the teen brain. And I am so on board with you saying, you know, the teen brain hasn't changed. Evolution doesn't change that quickly. Technology in the world has changed drastically. So when we talk about teens today, they're just like we were, but dealing with a very different world. So they're doing the best they can in the world we have right now and that we've created, which means we probably would have done it the exact same way. We weren't that great. I think we think we were so great when we were kids. No, we weren't. I drove my mom nuts. So what is consistent about the teen brain that we have to be really aware of no matter what is going on around them?
Yeah, I think that for me, the most important thing to keep in mind is that there are different metaphors for what the teenage brain is doing. And like, if whatever metaphor we end up keeping in our minds will shape how we deal with the teenage brain. So one metaphor is that young people are what I've called neurobiologically incompetent, that the moment puberty strikes, they get a frontal lobotomy and they cannot plan ahead. They can't reason logically. They're short-sighted. They're impulsive. They're selfish. They're frivolous. They can't pay attention, etc. And, you know, that view has a tradition. I mean, that goes back even to Plato in the Phaedrus, where you've got the unruly wild horses that need to be governed by the charioteer through whips and lashes. And that's the metaphor for the limbic or emotional regions of the brain needing to be controlled by the logical prefrontal regions. Yeah. And neuroscientists have, for the last few decades, been on board with that, in part because it's helped as a convenient legal argument for youth offenders. So kids who are arrested for violent crimes, they can say, no, you shouldn't have the death penalty or life in prison because this was a youthful, immature brain. They can't possibly be expected to think rationally. Yeah. And I get it. I mean, it is true that kids are not thinking of the lifelong consequences when they do something, you know, impulsive as a 15-year-old. But that doesn't mean they're not thinking. It means they're thinking about different stuff besides their long-term self-interest. Correct. So the updated view is a neurobiological competence model. That is, that they're really, really good at some stuff, but it's different than what grown-ups want them to be good at in general.
Yes, I love that.
And so what is it that the teenage brain is super duper good at? It's kind of like the R&D engine for our culture. It's like, as culture changes and technology changes, they have to adapt really quickly and figure out how to be successful in our culture and our society. And they do that way more quickly than adults. So what looks like a short attention span and frivolousness is often that they're just like engineers at the frontiers of technology, creating stuff long before adults can do it. I mean, and think about it. The same adults who might walk through the mall and see a bunch of teenagers loitering and complain about kids these days, like, oh, look at it. No one has a job like they had in my, they'll then go to the restaurant and be served perfectly well by a 16-year-old who does an amazing job, and the parents won't even notice.
Yeah.
Right. And so you can think of like the teenage brain as not incompetent, but as paying attention to different stuff. And when you know the other kind of stuff they're paying attention to, then we can tailor our communication styles and start having inspired, independent, autonomous, motivated young people in our lives.
That is fantastic. It is so true. It's different, and their priorities are so different from ours, and it doesn't make their priorities wrong. It makes them different. Now, my understanding, and correct me if this isn't correct, is that the brain is still, the prefrontal cortex is still developing and creating connections. And so some of the more complex skills, like emotional regulation and problem solving, are still being developed. It doesn't mean they can't do them, but right now they're primed to learn how to do them even better. So this is a time where we want them to be trying and practicing all these skills, but we can't expect them to have it down yet. Is that true?
Yeah, a version of that is true. So
Okay.
You can think of the brain as, especially emotion regulation, as what's called an experience dependent process. So there are some things that are experience independent, like if you drink milk, your bones are going to, grow or whatever. And like, it depends on the experience of having milk, but like, you don't have to tell, your bones or cells or whatever to do. That's just going to happen. But the wiring between the emotional and the rational regions of the brain, and those are simplified terms because actually it's more complicated than that.
Yeah.
It happens in response to experience. So you learn to regulate emotions by having to regulate emotions.
Yeah.
Now, what's interesting is that in the old model, you think of kind of logical reasoning, deductive thinking in the prefrontal regions that dampen and tamp down the impulsive emotional regions so that eventually they're kind of milder. But that now we know that's not really what's happening. What's happening instead is that the emotional regions of the brain are teaching the prefrontal regions what to care about. So that the limbic regions, like the nucleus accumbens and things like that, they're the teacher, in the prefrontal regions and also the hippocampus are the students. Actually, people don't know this, but Carol Dweck, who was my advisor, developed growth mindset theory and so on, is secretly a neuroscientist these days. And she published a very influential paper on how basically goal directedness, which you can think of all emotions as directed at some goal, either avoiding pain or gaining pleasure and so on. The goal directedness is in the driver's seat, and the prefrontal regions are the students. So what does that mean? What that means is that young people can deploy their considerable cognitive resources when they're highly motivated to do something that matters to them and that's important to them. And that experience in turn can actually change not just the brain, but also the mind, their lay theories of how things work. And so the challenge for us is that when there's a conflict, often it's that our goal that they need to regulate their emotions to do what we say isn't their goal.
Correct.
So it actually matters what they perceive as their goal in a given moment. Otherwise, their brain's not going to be the student, right? It's going to be, they're going to basically learn how to reject our goals as much as possible.
And I think this is diving right into the motivation right there, because I think what we're struggling with is not that kids aren't motivated. They're not motivated to do what we want them to be motivated to do. So when we talk about kids being unmotivated or lazy, it has nothing to do with the fact that they're unmotivated or lazy. It's just we want them to be focused on what we want them to be focused on.
Right. I mean, the same parents who complain about their kids not being motivated to do their math homework or practice the cello have kids who spend hours or maybe weeks planning how to sneak out of the house and go to a party with their friends. And right. Adriana Galvan, who's a neuroscientist who taught me a lot of this information, she's like, that's goal-directed behavior. Teenagers are very good. And, the Olympics are going on right now. We're 17-year-old Canadian just won the gold last night in swimming. Like,
amazing.
that's goal-directed behavior, for years and years. So it's not like they can't do it. It's that they have a different set of priorities. And so then our task as adults is to figure out the priorities that make sense to them from their perspective. And almost always it's going to come back to something about their social reputation, social status, their sense of respect, not in a frivolous way of like counting likes on social media, but in a deep, meaningful way that the young person is asking themselves, how am I a valuable contributor in the eyes of people whose opinions I care about? And often adults don't care about the answer to that question. They want compliance right now. They want you to listen because I said so, right? They want the young person to have my goals because I told you. And of course that makes sense when the kids are 4 and you need to get shoes on to go to school. But like, after 9, 10, you can't kind of take for granted that the optimal state is for the adolescent brain to do everything an adult says without question. Because that's actually not them being the R&D engine of our culture. No. So we have to have a little shift and transition. And that's hard for parents who've come from having young kids. But it makes a lot of sense.
It makes so much sense. And if you think about it, when you project them into the future, do we want kids that just do what they're told? And we see a lot of these kids in the workforce now, and I hear so many complaints, like these kids can't think for themselves. They're constantly just waiting to be told what to do. They do the bare minimum. And that's not because there's something wrong with them. It's how we've raised them to be.
Yeah, we've done it on purpose to them, right? Again, the brain and its connections with the emotion regions is an experience-dependent process. So if all the experience they've had at all times is the presumption that they should listen without question to all adults simply because the adult said so, then either they're not going to listen to anybody, or even worse, they're compliant. I mean, we have political problems we can't solve that there's no compromise on. And it's because everyone just thinks you have to pick a team and listen to what they say. And no one's like engaging in deliberative democracy, right? Yeah. And I think and that's true for all teams, all sides. And that's just one example among many where we need thoughtful young people who can consider nuanced alternatives and apply them in their lives and compare them to their own values. And if we do that, think about how much better our society is going to be, not just how much easier our lives are going to be as parents, but we've contributed a young person to the world who could be a source of innovation to solve our biggest problems if we do this right.
Yeah. I think one of the things that trip us up is we often perceive them trying to vocalize their own perceptions and what's important to them as being disrespectful. And we shut it down a lot and say, you're not allowed to say that. I see this frequently. And that sends a very bad message. I think that your opinion, if it differs from mine, is just simply wrong. And that's now we've just created somebody that doesn't learn to think independently.
Yeah, I think that the biggest kind of equivocation I often see is on the word respect or on the word listen. This is influenced in part by Rosalind Wiseman, who's a thoughtful parenting leader as well. And it's when parents say respect, what they mean is unquestioned obedience to what I just said. When kids say respect, what they mean is being heard and valued and listened to as a real person. Same with listening. Listen to me, right? That means do what I say immediately without protest. Kids, when they say nobody listens to me, what they mean is nobody cares about my perspective for why I might have legitimate reasons for being reluctant to do what you say. And what I would love to do is to help us get out of this equivocation and kind of have a definition of respect that we're all going to use, which is that people are treated as adult-like humans who have independent thoughts and feelings. Now, what I've learned is that there's a reason why adults view it one way and the kids view it the other. And it goes back to this neurobiological and competence model. If you fundamentally think that young people are not thinking, that they can't think, that they're impulsive, short-sighted, etc., then you don't want to know their perspectives because you know it's just wrong. Right. It's like, why would I ask you an open-ended question about your idiotic reasons that are short-sighted and selfish? Right. Like, because I, the adult, have already thought it through. I understand what you should be doing. So the main thing that needs to happen here is that you listen immediately. But if you have the neurobiological competence model, that young people see things we don't see, that they're adapting to culture before we are, that they see things, coming down the pipeline. And therefore they may have different implications for their own behavior. in light of the reputation that they'd either sacrifice or gain in their social groups, then it actually makes more sense to ask questions, to listen, and to see where they're coming from.
I love that so much. And I think that explains it so well that it is, we need to value them as a unique individual with their own minds and needs, and not as an extension of us that needs to do what we want them to do. And I
Yeah.
think this is where I see the most friction between parents and teens.
Yeah. There's a study I write about in the book that looks at a phenomenon I call grown-splaining, which is like mansplaining, but grown-ups,
Yeah.
telling kids what to do.
Yeah.
And the basic logic of grown-splaining is, if only you listen to my very clear and logical reasons for doing something, then you would change. But that doesn't work because in this one study, what they did is they took moms who were just nagging their teenage daughters, and they recorded that. And then they took the daughters into an fMRI scanner where there's a huge magnet detecting blood flow in regions of your brain. And then they just asked the question, what happens in the teenage brain when your mom is nagging you? And this is Jennifer Silk who did this, and Ron Dahl. I want to make sure to credit them. And what they found is that the kind of logical reasoning regions of the brain go down, that there's very little planning for how to think. The anger regions go up a lot, so they're pissed off, the teenage girls. But the most interesting one is the social cognition regions of the brain, the TPJ, temporoparietal junction. And those are the regions related to inferring the meaning of the speaker. And so think about it. A teenager sitting there, and the mom's just, or dad, a lot of times too, is just kind of yapping away. But they're not really saying what the young person needs to do. They're talking about a lot of stuff. Yeah. So in order for the young person to truly, quote, listen, they need to infer all this hidden meaning. And what you see instead in the scanner is that those regions are depressed. They're not active, which suggests that this feeling of in one ear, out the other that adults have is at some level neurobiologically true, but it's situationally based. It's based on the tone of our voice, us telling rather than asking, us failing to be transparent about what we're doing and why, us imposing our kind of like goals and values on young people without any input. When we create that context, then you see in one ear, out the other. But it turns out you can create a different context and have a very different outcome.
Yeah. Now I want to flip it a little bit, because I can hear parents in my head right now saying, so what? We just let them do whatever we want. We're the ones that are always wrong. They're the ones that are always right. We just let them watch video games or do video games all the day and not work on homework or do the things productive and help around the house. We know people are thinking this. How do we address that? Because those are real issues. For sure. Yeah. I think that the wrong way to respond to this is to say, oh, I guess we should just have no standards and let the inmates run the, nut house or whatever. And that's not what I'm saying. What I did in my book is I went and found expert leaders of young people. So like the best manager for 20-year-olds at Microsoft, the best high school physics teacher. I found an amazing parenting coach named Lorena Seidel. The best shooting coach for teenage NBA lottery draft picks that has to fix their shot and build trust so that way they don't go back to their old shot and then perform poorly. And what they all do is nothing like the letting young people run everything. In fact, they're super duper demanding, have ridiculously high expectations, but they have enough support so that young people can meet those expectations. And what we've learned is that there are two kind of ways to get it wrong. One way is what we call an enforcer mindset. That's where my job is to enforce high standards and you can meet them or not, but I can't do anything to influence you. And you come across kind of like an authoritarian dictator. Yeah. You might get compliance, but it's not willful compliance. But the alternative is people say, well, I don't want to be a mean authoritarian, so I'm going to be really nice. And that's what I call a protector mindset. And that's the idea that my job is to protect you from distress, from low self-esteem. I need to boost your confidence, and I'm going to do it step by step. And so what ends up happening is there's very low expectations. You get walked all over. You feel even more like I've contributed to a society that's going to hell in a handbasket because I have no control over my children, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a middle way. And the middle way is something we call a mentor mindset.
And that's the idea that you can have very high standards and very high support. And that combination causes them to develop in ways where they can be meaningful contributors to our culture. They can still follow rules, etc. But they're not meeting the standards only because we dictated those standards to them. They're doing it out of an internalized concern for what we are concerned about, but also for the future that they want to build. And it's not a fantasy. I just saw so many examples of this, and their stories are all in the book, and their practices, the secret practices of these great mentor mindset leaders. They're all in the book, and they're luckily things that anyone can start doing right away.
So give us some examples, because I think there's going to be a very difficult line to walk. And I think people struggle with the mentoring versus the controlling, or micromanaging, I think would be more the right word. Like I see a lot of micromanaging from the perspective of I'm helping them and I'm teaching them. What's the difference?
Well, I think that if you uphold a really high standard, let's say for personal conduct, cleaning your room, helping around the house or whatever, young people are going to complain, because they don't want to be doing those things. And the easiest way to get them to stop complaining is to just get rid of your standards, right? To be like, all right, fine, I'll do it. Right. I have 4 kids. I understand how that goes. And sometimes when we uphold the standard, then it turns into a fight, a shouting match, etc. And so we're like, well, who have I become? Right.
Yeah.
And what I've learned is a couple things. One is that a major reason why there are complaints is because we're usually not super transparent about why we're upholding a standard. We just say, I need you to do this. Why? Because I said so. Yeah. But we don't explain anything. Right. And explanations, turns out, are ways of respecting young people. That, if I asked you to do something for me that I should do myself, if I didn't have a reason for it, I would just come across like a jerk if I said that to another adult, right? I'm manipulating you or something. But we talk to teenagers like that all the time in ways that would be totally inappropriate to talk to another adult.
Yeah, exactly.
And the problem is that we think they're still a child and they think they're an adult. So there's a 2 to 3 year gap in communication where they feel talked down to and we feel like we're being appropriate. And so it turns out that sometimes you can ask exactly the same thing, but just be clearer about your intentions and what your plan is. And also how you're trying to help them to be a better person, to be happy, to be a good contributor, all those other things. So transparency is a simple step. Yeah. A second one, a little bit harder, but very important, is questioning. And that's the idea of asking for basically their perspectives on things rather than simply telling.
Yeah.
And there are certain questions that don't work. So what were you thinking is a bad question because it implies you weren't thinking and I'm looking down on you. Right. But, trying to actually understand where they were coming from with a curiosity and what we call an authentic question with uptake. That's a question where I'm curious about the answer. And my question is building on something I heard you say. When you do those 2 things, they feel respected and listened to. They often start telling you what you want. And I'll tell you what, a lot of this stuff comes from great tactics for negotiating with hostages.
Yes.
Which sometimes it's negotiating with a teenager about going to a party feels like a hostage negotiation.
Yep.
Right. And it turns out the same tactics that work for, returning hostages work for talking with teenagers. And I read about that kind of stuff in the book.
That is so true. I think the power of empathy and validating what they're feeling, we struggle with because people see it as agreeing with them and saying, oh, I'm going to agree that they're mad at me because they have a right to. It doesn't mean agreeing with them. It just means we're recognizing what they feel, which is non-negotiable, what they feel.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah. So, I think that there's a good phrase Dr. Becky uses which is the most charitable interpretation. And I think you can apply that here that, with the teenager, if they're doing a behavior that's infuriating for us, let pause to think, what's the most charitable possible interpretation of how that is actually deep down their way to get status and respect, either relative to us or relative to peers. If we start from that curiosity of trying to understand them first, again, it doesn't have to mean we agree with them, but you're just going to be in a better negotiating position if you understand what they truly want, right? Because like that's the problem with negotiation is you offer something they don't want, and then you get, you can end up with a bad deal. But if you know what someone wants first, then you end up offering a deal they're willing to accept. And often that's kind of what it's like to negotiate with teenagers.
Yeah, I tell parents a lot of time, I say, you provide a solution, but you're solving for your problem, not their problem, and then getting upset that they're not okay with the solution. And that I see a lot. And so I know parents are still going, okay, you still haven't told me how to motivate them to do their homework.
Oh, well, there's 380 pages in the book about this, but I would say that there are different reasons why they don't do their homework. So one is that if the homework is hard, then sometimes they feel dumb when they try and they fail. Mm-hmm. And so there's a concern, this is the fixed mindset concern, that the feeling of effort is revealing a lack of ability and potential. Yeah. A related point is that if it's also under time pressure, like it's super duper due tomorrow, then there's an anxiety, like your heart's racing, your palms are sweaty, like you're breathing heavy. And so there's a chapter in the book on how to deal with those worries. And what we found in a paper we published in Nature a few years ago is that reframing difficulty as, first of all, a sign that you've chosen to do something ambitious and hard, something important, and so that worry actually is a good thing because it means you care about something meaningful. And second, that physiological arousal, the racing heart, the knots in your stomach, the sweaty palms, that's actually your body mobilizing resources to help you do better. So the reason why you sweat is to cool down your body. And so a cooler body is going to work more effectively. Why is your heart racing? Your heart's racing to get more oxygenated blood to your brain. So, we know that all cells are better with more oxygen. So the more your brain has oxygenated blood, the smarter your brain's going to be, and so on and so forth. And I say this kind of stuff to my kids all the time. And of all the, I'm a psychologist, so obviously you overdo it with your own kids. But of all the things that I do, that's the one where like, okay, I'm on board with that. And so you reframe worry and anxiety as excitement and your body having resources, and then it ends up helping them. Now, there are other reasons why they don't do their homework. They don't see the point or whatever, but I have chapters on that as well in the book and very practical tools.
Yeah. So let's just break it down to maybe the 3 key takeaways that parents need from this conversation that can help them take the next step in just connecting and just understanding their teen better.
Yeah. So the 3 things that I think are probably the most important are, one, when we have tough conversations where there's a goal conflict, like I want you to do something, you're doing something different. The first major thing is thinking about tone and word choice. And so there's a contrast in the literature between what's called autonomy supportive language and controlling language. And autonomy supportive is things like, you might consider, have you thought about, kind of, here's the reason why. Controlling is like, you should, you must do this because I said so. Thank you for your cooperation. Yeah. And there are actually, just the change from should to consider or might, those tiny changes end up making a big difference. So that's tone. That's first point. Second point is, what values are you appealing to in your appeal? And often the value is, I have to get to work as an adult and you need to not ruin my, or I need to do this. And, our schedule is not their value. But there are values that they have that could be aligned with our schedule or whatever our priorities are. Right. So a sense of purpose is a huge one that I pull on a lot. Like, okay, well, this homework you're going to do, you're going to build a skill that's going to give you a strong brain. And there are a bunch of problems out there in society that my generation hasn't fixed. In fact, we've probably screwed them up even more. So we're depending on your brain to be thoughtful and smart to fix those. So every time you're doing your homework and doing well in school, you're taking a step toward fixing the problems that my generation created and didn't fix. Well, that's a value that they care about, right? Yeah. So the second point is, and there are a bunch of examples in the book, aligning our arguments with a value that they already care about, rather than trying to get them to care about something that they don't care about. Yeah. And the third is, give yourself do-overs when you screw up. I learned this from one of the parenting coaches that, we're all raised in a culture that basically has done everything about teenagers wrong for all of human history, right? There are just pockets of excellence. So we shouldn't expect ourselves as parents to get it right the first time, but that's fine. It's not like addiction where you fall off the wagon and you're like, now I'm never going to get back on the wagon again. It's like, no, there's endless redos. And I've started doing this based on the parenting coach I write about, where I go up to my kids. I'm like, I didn't handle this in the way that our family values would say we should. What I meant to do is the following. Now, I'm still going to ask you to do this, but I should have asked you for your reasons why it's hard for you to do it. So can you just tell me a little bit so I can understand? And then I'd like to troubleshoot. And it turns out that they forget the first blow up. They're not sitting there mad at me forever. They're more like, oh, okay, I guess we can figure it out. And those do-over conversations become shorter and shorter and shorter over time. And sometimes they can just happen with an eyebrow where you're like, all right, yes, Dad, you did it wrong. Here's what I meant. Here's what you could do. I'm like, okay, thanks, Scarlett. Yeah. So I think that those are the three. Is like our tone needs to be autonomy supportive. Our arguments need to be aligned with their values, even if they're with our goals. And third is practice do-overs.
And all three of those things are amazing things to model to our teenagers, because when we do it for them, they start doing it for us. And most of the time, that's what we've been trying to get them to do the whole time anyway. So when we take control of ourselves and how we're showing up, everything changes. I could talk to you for hours and hours more. There's so many more questions I have for you, and this has been really enlightening for me and really interesting. But how can people find you? And tell us about your book.
Yeah, the book's called 10 to 25, The Science of Motivating Young People. And if you care about or know anything about young people aged 10 to 25, then the book is for you. And we want to just put an end to this problem of endless miscommunications that cause frustration for everybody, and kind of stop fighting a war between the generations and start inspiring the next generation. And people can get it at Barnes & Noble. They can get it at Amazon. Simon & Schuster is my publisher for bulk discounts. Buy it for all your friends. And I'm just on LinkedIn. People can find me, or at University of Texas at Austin. I have a professor website. So very nerdy and boring websites full of information.
What are you researching now?
Well, what we're thinking, I've always focused on kids in school. So how do you transition middle to high school to college? And now we're thinking about workforce. So even in a scenario where you've got 20-year-olds who are prepared, are they entering workplaces where the managers are doing a good job? And also, how about the 70% of kids that are not going to four-year colleges? Do they have bosses that know anything about the status and respect young people need? Yeah. Or are they doomed to a life of, overnight shifts at Walmart with bad managers? And so we're thinking a lot about alternative pathways to the workforce for people, regardless of your level of college education, not trying to change the employees, although of course we hope they grow, but the managers in the workplaces. So that way they're welcoming, inviting, inspiring, and motivating.
That's amazing. And when they are, their employees become. So that's fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really, really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And that's a wrap. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of Parenting Teens with Dr. Cam. Don't forget to hit follow so you don't miss a single episode, and share the love by passing this on to a friend. Until next time, keep making a positive impact in your teen's life.